one of the Great Lakes, and this beach along here is basically creating an erosion zone, and then it starts moving back and it becomes what's called a barrier beach. And normally this has much more of a lump, but because there's been a high water year for a number of years, it's actually washed the barrier beach away. And that barrier beach, in the background you can see the wetland ecosystem that it normally protects. Because this barrier beach has been wiped out, then it needs to have restoration work done on it so that we can consolidate the soil, and so that the sand is not moving into the wetland, and the wetland is protected from the open lake. There's a significant amount of biodiversity in the wetland that's behind here. It's actually a biosphere reserve, and so protecting that really important ecosystem is really important. So what we would need to do is to re-establish the vegetation on this mound, to allow the sand to be consolidated and held in place again. And a number of different techniques are planting things like beach grass and switchgrass, things that have deep root systems that will hold the sand, and then the vegetative matter actually slows down the sand movement and helps drop it out of the air, and then that'll start building up this barrier beach again. There's a number of different techniques that I had talked about earlier, and I'll show you some different graphics for using things like grass and pushing it into the soil, or using sticks and pushing it into the soil, or even just putting up a barrier of something like snow fence, so it slows down the movement of the sand and allows it to start accumulating and building up in this area again. This marsh is considered a World Heritage, and so protecting it is really important. This is a really healthy marsh behind here, and you can see there's a whole diversity of different species back there, and protecting that is really important. And so this is an open wetland system, and you can see areas of land and areas of open water, and that allows for more biodiversity to exist. The closer areas are where the shallower species are, and the further away species are much deeper, but you can see there's vegetation all the way across the water, so the water is not actually very deep at all. But we also need to re-establish this beach, barrier beach, by re-establishing the vegetation, and once it's stabilized, then the soil will be able to support these different tree species again. In the background you can see how this barrier breach originally was. There's an area that has trees still, and that would have extended all the way along here. And this is what's left over, so a lot of the sediment has been removed, and this is actually the root system of the trees that's been left sticking out of the water. And then as we go back here, you can see how the flow of water has gone back into this ecosystem, back into the marsh, and it's washed a lot of the sand along. Basically what we call this is a blowout. So it's blown out this whole area, and the water has gone into the marsh where it shouldn't have been. There should be its normal groundwater infiltration, but flow of water didn't exist here before, and so there's a lot of sediment that's been washed into the marsh, and this actually used to be a little area of marsh. So it's just this dynamic nature of different ecosystems. And here you can see some recolonization happening on the ground. All the big trees that were here before are now recolonizing. So this is a poplar, a cottonwood species, and we've even got some monarchs around here. that are assembling, and they kind of colonize trees for a little while, and then when the wind's just right, they all move across the lake. So they use the winds, and because the lake is such a big lake, it takes a lot of energy to move across that, so they wait for the right conditions. And some of the trees in the fall, you'll see, are just coated with orange as they prepare to move across for their migration in the fall. And this is the staging area for their migration all the way down to Mexico. It's a managed wildlife area, and you can see that there's these dike system that actually goes all around these different sections of these marshes, and they can actually raise and lower the water level to manage the aquatic species in them. And you can see that there's this berm, so you start with your dryland species, and as you go down the berm, you start getting into moister species, and then you can see this yellow band, and those are quite moist species, and then down into your emergent zone along the edge of the water. And then you can see the pond weeds and the water lilies. The pond weeds are what we call our submergent species, and then you have your water lilies, which are our floating leaf species. And the species that are in the water are what's providing a lot of oxygen, and they're providing habitat for all sorts of insects. And this is the breeding ground of different fish and different insects, and so they're very rich in their diversity because of all that habitat structure and all the different little niches that you can have in between all these different plants and on these different plants, feeding on these plants. And the emergent zone is a very rapidly growing system, and it's actually a disturbance system because during the winter there's ice scour and there's things like wave action, and so this is a zone that's fairly regularly disturbed, and so they've developed systems where they can rapidly recolonize areas. So wetlands are actually a fun ecosystem to work with, because within 1 year you can have rapid growth and reestablishment of the aquatic community, because a lot of times in the winter time it'll scour out entire areas, and by the end of the year it's been recolonized. So it needs to have that rapid recolonization ability to survive this very dynamic ecosystem. And further up the shore, you're getting species that can not only tolerate very wet conditions, but when the water goes down, you can get very dry, and so they need to be able to withstand being completely dry and still survive. So it's this constant fluctuation that you get in a normal wetland, and you get these different zones and these different abilities of these different aquatic ecosystems to be able to survive and to withstand being not only submerged underwater, but being able to survive on dry land. And because they don't have to worry about water, they can rapidly grow, and so wetlands actually have a huge amount of biomass that they produce every year. So a lot of these species just die down completely down to a mudflat, and then in springtime they just quickly reestablish the ecosystem. And it's extremely dynamic, because 1 year you'll see this yellow patch all over the place, and then the next year it'll be all purple, and the next year it'll be all green. And so there's this constant moving around of different species within the ecosystem. The ecosystem to be dynamic, and it also allows for different species to exist, and they exist for long periods of time in the anoxic soil. They drop their seeds down, and then they're waiting basically until there's a drawdown, and then there's oxygen for the seed, and suddenly they all germinate. If it's below the water, then they're not germinating, they're just sitting there, and they can wait for years and years. So it's this oxygenation process and this fluctuation of the water levels within a wetland, the constant disturbance and the constant moving around of different species within the ecosystem. So it's extremely dynamic and produces tons of biomass. And it's also producing, because it's producing so much biomass, it's producing a very thick organic layer at the bottom. And that organic layer is accumulating rapidly, because once it goes below a certain level in the water, it's reduced oxygen levels, and the microorganisms can't break it down as quickly, and so you get an accumulation of carbon in these ecosystems. So on the other side of me, you can see this is the marsh that the barrier beach is protecting. So on this side we have the land, and then it moves into this aquatic system, and then by the lake there's the barrier beach that we looked at. And so this is being protected, the entire thing, by that barrier beach. And so the wave action from this big lake or from an ocean is protecting the marshes behind. And so then you can have this rich ecosystem, but it's also connected by groundwater to the lake system, and so you get this water level fluctuation that's happening at the same time. The beaches are sandy, and the barrier beach is mostly sand and gravel, and so it's intimately connected together. And so if the lake goes down, then this marsh goes down as well. And because it's such a dynamic ecosystem, you're always getting this movement back and forth of different species, and it's so rich with different plants, but so that you also have this huge diversity of insects, huge diversity of birds, and huge diversity of animals living in there. So there's muskrats and all sorts of things, and herons using this landscape. Fish, it's a nursery for fish as well. So these are some of the nature-based solutions, and a lot of the nutrients that are coming off of the land, the first thing they go into is this marsh system, and the marsh system is rapidly using all those nutrients and cleaning the water before it infiltrates into the lake. So having a healthy marsh ecosystem it's like having healthy kidneys, and it cleans and detoxifies the water. And the plants also have this function where they're pumping oxygen into the root system, and it stimulates the microbial community, and those microbes are the ones that are breaking down the toxic chemicals before they're released into the lake. So it has this slow movement through the marsh, tons of plants dropping oxygen into the root system, the microbes breaking it down, and then you get clean water. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support keeps these videos free for everyone.